Once, in a town where the sun seemed to rise a little later than it should and the shadows clung to the corners of every street, there lived a girl named Lila. She was ordinary in most ways: dark hair, pale skin, and a tendency to wear clothes that hid her from the world. But there was something about her eyes. They were too wide, too dark, as if they were always on the verge of seeing something just out of sight. Lila had a secret, one she had buried deep inside her for as long as she could remember. She could hear things. Not the kind of things that other people could hear, like the chirping of birds or the distant hum of traffic, but things that shouldn't be heard. The whispers in the dark, the creak of footsteps in an empty room, the soft sigh of breath when no one else was there. Lila had tried to ignore it, to pretend that she was like everyone else, but the sounds only grew louder. They filled her ears at night, making it impossible to sleep. They followed her in the daylight, their presence a constant reminder that she was different. She couldn't tell anyone about it. They would think she was crazy, and maybe she was. But the sounds were real to her, so real that sometimes she wondered if they might be trying to tell her something. One evening, as the sky bled into twilight, Lila found herself wandering the outskirts of town. It was a place she rarely visited, a stretch of road that led into the woods, where the trees grew so thick that they blocked out the sun. There was an old house there, hidden behind a wall of overgrown bushes and ivy. It had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded up and its doors locked tight. The townspeople said it was haunted, that anyone who entered would never come out again. Lila had always been curious about the house, but she had never been brave enough to go near it. Until now. The whispers had led her there, guiding her steps until she stood before the rusted gate that guarded the entrance. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of decay and something else, something sweeter, like rotting fruit. Lila hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever before, urging her forward. She pushed open the gate, its hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The path to the house was overgrown with weeds and thorns, but Lila barely noticed them as they scratched at her legs. She was focused on the house, on the darkened windows that seemed to watch her as she approached. The door was cracked open, just enough for her to slip through. She hesitated again, her fingers brushing against the rough wood. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening, and she could feel something pulling her inside. She stepped over the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into darkness. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she fumbled for the light switch, but there was nothing. No light, no switch, just the oppressive blackness pressing in on her. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a silence so thick that it seemed to swallow the sound of her breathing. Lila took a step forward, her hand outstretched, searching for something to hold onto. Suddenly, a cold hand grabbed her wrist, and she screamed, jerking away from the touch. She stumbled back, tripping over something on the floor and falling hard onto her back. Pain shot through her as she hit the ground, but she barely noticed it. Her heart was racing, her mind reeling with the terror that gripped her. The darkness was alive, moving around her, closing in on her. A faint light flickered in the distance, and Lila scrambled to her feet, her eyes locked on the source. It was coming from a doorway at the end of the hall, a pale, sickly glow that seemed to pulse with every beat of her heart. She moved towards it, drawn by some unseen force, her feet moving of their own accord. The whispers had returned, soft and insistent, urging her on. As she reached the doorway, the light grew brighter, blinding her for a moment. When her vision cleared, she found herself standing in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floor littered with dust and debris. In the center of the room was a table, and on it sat an old, leather-bound book. The cover was worn and cracked, the pages yellowed with age. Lila felt a strange compulsion to pick it up, her fingers tingling as they brushed against the leather. The moment she touched the book, the room seemed to shift around her. The air grew colder, and the whispers turned into a low, droning hum. Lila's hands shook as she opened the book, her eyes scanning the pages. The words were written in a language she didn't understand, but she could feel their meaning in the pit of her stomach. It was a story about a girl who could hear things that others couldn't. A girl who was led to an old, abandoned house by whispers in the dark. A girl who found a book just like this one. Lila's breath caught in her throat as she realized the story was about her. The book was telling her story, her thoughts, her fears. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding in her chest. The words seemed to move, shifting and changing as she read, but she couldn't stop. She was compelled to keep going, to see how the story would end. As she reached the final page, Lila's hands froze. The words were written in bold, black letters, stark against the yellowed paper. They were simple, yet they filled her with a terror so profound that she felt as though she might faint. The words read, "She was never alone." Lila felt a presence behind her, a cold breath on the back of her neck. She wanted to turn around, to see what was there, but she couldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, her eyes fixed on the words in the book. The presence grew stronger, closer, until she could feel it hovering just inches away from her. A hand reached out and touched her shoulder, and Lila's scream echoed through the empty house. She spun around, the book falling from her hands and landing on the floor with a dull thud. The room was empty, but the presence was still there, pressing down on her, suffocating her. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and Lila clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block them out. But they were inside her head now, screaming at her, telling her things she didn't want to hear. She backed away, her eyes wild with fear, until she was pressed against the wall. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls narrowing, the ceiling lowering. Lila's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she searched for a way out. But there was no escape. The door had disappeared, the window sealed shut. She was trapped, and the whispers were growing louder, more insistent. They were telling her to look down, to see what was at her feet. She didn't want to, but her eyes were drawn to the floor, to the book that lay open on the ground. The pages were blank now, but something was rising from them, a dark, shapeless form that writhed and twisted as it took shape. Lila watched in horror as the darkness grew, filling the room with a cold, suffocating presence. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that echoed in her mind. They were telling her to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness was all around her, closing in on her, swallowing her whole. Lila's scream was lost in the void as the darkness consumed her, pulling her into its depths. The last thing she saw was the book, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. Then there was nothing but blackness, an endless, suffocating void. And the whispers, soft and distant now, fading into silence.